Greetings from St. Paul, Minnesota. It's great to be with you, though I wish I was there in person and not via Skype. I hope that the technology today does not prove to be too clunky. Thank you to Shannon for inviting me to put forward a proposal with her, and to Ashley for joining our team as well. This is truly the power of networking. The three of us have never met in person, but we're connected through Janet Schulenberg, who knew of our mutual interest in social justice and advising. So thank you, Janet. As we begin today, we want to say something about our social locations as presenters and ways that our identities confer privilege or shape experiences of oppression in our lives. We also want to share something of ourselves and our intentions. So this graphic conveys some of the complexities of our multiple identities and ways that both the spectrum and dualities of our identities are part of systems of privilege, domination, and oppression. What I've tried to capture with my social locations are the work that dominant culture identities require. So, for example, as a white person trying to identify with the white people in history who acted for racial justice, the abolitionists and not the slave-owning founders. I'm going to get us started today discussing a few strands of theory, and then we're hoping that you'll do the heavy lifting of connecting it to practice through some case studies coming later. Parts of this may be familiar if you participated in the NACADA webinar about social justice in the spring, wherein I talked about Paulo Freire and advising for praxis. But I'll try to layer in some other concepts that I think will add to it and bring it more clearly to light in terms of practice implications. Before I get into theory, I want to take a minute and have you think about this question. What is your dream for each and every student that you advise? And I'm guessing that you have some interest in a better world if you're choosing our session on advising for social justice. And I'm also guessing that you have some hope about your work, so that it accomplishes something bigger than yourself. And I think that being grounded in that dream that you have for your students is an important part of advising more generally, but certainly when we're talking about advising for social justice. So here we go with a little theory. I had heard of critical theory and critical pedagogy and Paulo Freire here and there for a long time, but never really dove into it until I began my doctoral studies here at the University of St. Thomas a few years ago. So what is critical theory? Critical theory has a number of strands, and there is capital C, capital T critical theory, as well as many small c, small t critical theories. And the capital letters are ones are referring to the Frankfurt School of philosophers like Horkheimer, Adorno, Marcuse, and Habermas. And many of whom, or all of whom, are influenced by Marx. So in the small CT sense, you may have heard about critical race theory, critical gender theories, which are bringing similar approaches to scholarship and ways of knowing. And they're theories that are moving us away from oppression or enslavement or control, or many sorts of both of many sorts, like both self-inflicted and not, and toward liberation. And I would add liberation that's won together and not by some sort of mythical Ayn Randian hegemonic individual. So Bowman gives us the following distillation of Horkheimer's definition. Critical theory is adequate only if it meets three criteria. It must be explanatory, practical, and normative all at the same time. That is, it must explain what is wrong with current social reality, identify the actors to change it, and provide both clear norms for criticism and achievable practical goals for social transformation. So you can hopefully see where this is relevant to social justice. We see and name the injustice in the world. We understand the people involved in the relationships of power, and we take practical action, with action being a part. With action being a part of this, there's an ethical and moral dimension that we don't think about enough in advising. And I'll own that. I don't think we think about it enough in advising. Ethical and moral implications are a big reason why this appeals to me. And I don't think that we have the capacity for neutrality in the ways that we often think that we do, nor do I think that it's desirable. So this practical action is where pedagogy comes in, and we talk about critical pedagogy, which was Freire's big contribution. So Streck, Redden, and Zitkowski, 2012, explain Freire's contribution to pedagogy as it relates to critical theory. Knowledge is not only cognitive, it is also practice. It is impossible to separate theory and practice. That is possibly Paulo Freire's most important contribution to the history of pedagogy, that the most important content of education is practice. The most important content of education is how and not the what. And this how, this practice, is knowledge. So we get that theory and action are inseparable parts of understanding, and this is what we call praxis. So action, reflection, action. Praxis is the essence of what we're inviting students to do in advising. You've taken a set of courses, reflect and theorize what it means to have had that experience. Then use that theorizing to guide further action, be it your next set of courses or choices that the experiences of those courses lead you to beyond where you were when we met last semester. My imperfect example of this is the finance major who has chosen that field of study based on the premise that they will wind up with a job that will let them have a comfortable life with a big house and a boat. On the one hand, this is laudable and shows self-knowledge about the advisee's desires and an indication of where their values currently stand. However, the student needs to take action for further reflection, perhaps shadowing someone in the comfortable life field of work and taking courses in that field. More potently, you might raise questions about what informs the student's values and what reflection has led them to those desires. And I'll say more about these questions in a bit. So Freire writes about levels of consciousness, or maybe motions of consciousness would be a better way of describing it. One would be intransitive, which is the sort of lack of consciousness beyond our biology. So just having your basic biological needs met. The next would be naive transitivity, wherein there is a budding awareness of the contradictions around a person, of one's historical circumstances, but one that accepts those circumstances and even engages in what might be called magical thinking to hold that worldview together. So here a person is susceptible to what Freire calls massification. So they're conforming, and they can be used by people with power for the fanaticism that they sort of hold inside them. Beyond this, there's critical consciousness, which is a level of consciousness in which a person begins to understand themselves as what Freire calls historical beings. So they name the world and their oppression together with others, and they engage in actions to change the world. So they're theorizing about their experiences and action democratically for their own liberation and the liberation of others. And these happen simultaneously, so critical consciousness is in the action, not just before the action. If we think about advising for social justice, we want to try to move students towards critical consciousness, a process Freire calls conscientization, or translated from the Portuguese, conscientization. So thinking back to your hope and dream for each advisee, did it involve them changing the world for the better? And this is where advising for praxis comes in. And this is not a new idea. Hemwall and Trachte point to Freire and praxis in a 1999 article in the Nakata Journal. They give reasons for why praxis is a good idea. It's likely to fit into the common good missions of our institutions in higher ed. It fits neatly under the ideal of a liberal arts education as a means of developing those lenses for seeing and transforming the world. And it emphasizes dialogue, which is usually our primary tool as advisors. So it's a dialogue that sets goals and challenges students to articulate the meaning and purpose of higher education. So Freire's critical pedagogy gives us a goal for advising, movement towards critical consciousness. It also gives us dialogue as the mechanism. So goal and mechanism are my words, and there may be critical pedagogues that would take issue with them, but it works for me in the moment trying to explain why I like Freire for thinking about advising for social justice. And Freire has a lot of beautiful, passionate things to say about dialogue, and it's important to know that he sees dialogue as a very egalitarian moment. So true dialogue doesn't happen in the rigid hierarchy of the educator above the student, but rather the educator approaches the dialogue with awareness that he or she may be changed by the experience, and they approach it with great love and faith in humanity, as well as hope and humility. True dialogue doesn't happen without critical thinking, and it situates learning in a student's lived experiences, particularly those experiences of oppression or injustice. So how you actualize advising for praxis, I don't actually know, but I have a few ideas for you to think about. The first is an obvious one, and that is that we must engage in our own critical reflection. So Stephen Brookfield writes in Becoming a Critically Reflective Teacher that critical reflection is the hunt for assumptions of power and hegemony that needs to be considered from as many angles as possible. And this includes the perspective of the advisor, the student, colleagues, and theoretical literature. Advisors seeking critical reflection might, one, engage in systematic reflection on their own interactions with students through journaling or making a quick set of notes right after an advising meeting. Two, they might find a way to solicit the perspective of the students in ways that allow a student to give honest reflections. And this isn't satisfaction feedback, but actual reflection on the dialogue and the learning. And asking a colleague to observe your advising and provide honest feedback opens up opportunities for critical reflection. And the colleague who may help your criticality the most, says Brookfield, may be the colleague for whom you would feel the most vulnerable inviting to provide it. And lastly, theoretical literature provides kind of some acme for that praxis, that critical reflection. So we must always be reading. So idea one, to advise for praxis, engage in your own critical reflection. The last two are more cut and dried than the first in terms of my suggestions here. One thing that I've done to solicit students' feedback is to provide an anonymous web form that allows them to answer questions about what the conversation with me was like. I've also kept a set of notes to self about how I felt each conversation went and how my identities may have hindered or helped the conversation. If you Google Stephen Brookfield's critical incident questionnaire, you'll find a document that he uses at the end of a class that might be adaptable for you. Idea two, seek out powerful questions. So questions of emerging relevance, questions that might feel funny to ask to some of your students, questions that require risk and vulnerability to ask and to answer. Here are some examples of questions that I've used, and I have other examples. If you want to contact me via email, I'd be happy to share my whole list. These are ones kind of related to social justice, but I find it a useful way to go about bringing up other topics. So the goal of these questions is to get into deeper dialogues. It can seem a little inauthentic, but if you can own it, it can work for you. Idea three, problematize the curriculum. So this is a Freirean term that has to do with examining the relationships of power. So again, hunting for those hegemonic assumptions. And one of these is the assumption that a student must have a college education in order to have a comfortable life. I've sometimes pointed out to students that we might not have a just society if that assumption is true. So some questions to problematize: who gets to decide the curriculum? Whose voices are represented? How democratic is the curriculum? Is it a just society if you feel you have to jump through curricular hoops to have a comfortable life? I don't necessarily use these questions directly with students, but they help me think through adding challenge to dialogues with students. However, the challenges don't mean that the curriculum is without value. So when you hear from a student, I don't want to take history because I'm a business major, there's a useful paradox that opens if we allow the curriculum to be critically examined. So try responding with, given your experience of history, how do you know it to be a waste of time? In order to render an intellectually honest response, the student will need to have an understanding of history. They can't critique it without having studied it. And an advisor thinking of praxis can use interrogation of the curriculum to explore the complexities of the world with a student, hopefully showing them that they're gaining the skills to solve problems and transform the world. So the risk of imposition of values are present in our conversations with students, whether we have values clarification in mind or not. Sorry. Sorry about that. I got a little ahead of it myself in my notes. So idea 4, when you're engaged in goal setting with students, bring up common good missions of your institutions or higher education in general, asking not just what they want to do or major in, but why. And if the opportunity presents itself, trying to tie that conversation back to values and values clarification. So we have already thought of our hope and our dream for students, and that is a step in rejecting neutrality. So values clarification is a risky conversation, but one that we have to have if we want that world transformation. And the risk of imposing values are present in our conversations with students, whether we have values clarification in mind or not. Another strand of social theory that I want to reference here is from 2 French sociologists, Bourdieu and Passeron. In their book, Reproduction in Education, Society, and Culture, they write about education as an act of symbolic violence. So think about that for a minute. They say all pedagogic action is objectively symbolic violence insofar as it is the imposition of a cultural arbitrary by an arbitrary power. So the educational system constructed by dominant culture reproduces itself, and the relationships of power reproduce themselves through education, and that's why we're always asking this question: who has access to higher education to compensate? Higher education is the place where dominant culture holds on to the means of knowledge production too. So it's not just who can get exposure to the knowledge, but who gets to produce knowledge through scholarship. Another piece of their work is that the system of education confers different types of capital. So economic capital we're probably all familiar with, but also cultural and social capital. So going back to my call for encouraging values clarification, we must be cautious about engaging in symbolic violence, particularly when we're working with students whose social locations don't confer the privileges of dominant culture, which comes with social and cultural capital. So much of our discussion today will focus on how we serve students. Dr. Buffy Smith uses Bourdieu and Passeron as a theoretical base for her study of mentoring relationships with at-risk students. And I should mention here, Buffy Smith and Stephen Brookfield are both faculty members here at St. Thomas. So if you're wondering where I'm coming up with all this, it's just what's around me. Though Stephen is widely published, and Buffy had a book come out a couple years ago called Mentoring At-Risk Students Through the Hidden Curriculum of Higher Education. And that's probably essential reading if you want to set up a program for mentoring students who are historically underrepresented. And we can take a critical lens at the language of at-risk. It's not language that I would choose because it's language of deficit and not strength. It further normalizes dominant culture by making it the point of comparison. And as a friend of Buffy, I'm guessing that her publisher maybe had more to do with the title than anyone else. So students come to campus with what Bourdieu and Passeron called a habitus, and Smith defines that for us this way because it's a kind of a $5 word. So a cumulative cultural capital from childhood to adulthood that is primarily formed and shaped by one's family's social class, background, and schools. So Smith explains cultural capital as a cultural resource manifested through behaviors that mirror cultural dispositions, norms, knowledge, attitudes, preferences, tastes, mannerisms, abilities, competencies, and skills that individuals learn because of their habitus, because of those past experiences and upbringing. So there are various types of cultural capital, one of which is institutionalized cultural capital. So institutional cultural capital is the quantity and quality of information and knowledge that an individual has about the culture of an institution. And it manifests itself in actions and behaviors and skills. Implied by this concept of habitus is that higher education has a hidden curriculum. And Smith explains hidden curriculum as a set of unwritten norms, values, and expectations that unofficially governs how individuals interact with and evaluate one another. This influences individuals' ability and performance in the formal curriculum. For example, a student is expected to be proactive and schedule an appointment with a professor if he earns a failing grade on an exam. So the hidden curriculum are all these unwritten rules and possible actions that those with cultural capital of the cultural capital of, let's say, a parent who attended university have, and those without the same capital do not. Smith goes on to write about effective mentorship based on a qualitative study she conducted. And this mentorship is not the same thing as advising, but there are parts of her writing that I think can be instructive for serving students from underrepresented groups. So one point from Smith is that higher education, perhaps for its very survival, seeks to diversify the students it serves, and it must then help those students understand cultural capital and any other forms of capital necessary to navigate the hidden curriculum. And she talks about 3 cycles of mentoring with varying degrees of capital sharing. So sharing your knowledge of the institution. So how do we help students navigate that hidden curriculum? Again, engage in reflection on what ways in which you may have navigated it and ways in which your own privilege and or experiences of oppression made the hidden curriculum implicitly visible or not. So this reflection is our, self-reflection is a big theme here. Smith then describes the 3 cycles of what I would relabel prescriptive moving to intrusive advising. So many of us may not have great comfort with intrusive advising, but Smith's idea also says that as we move toward what we might call a greater intrusiveness, we simultaneously move toward greater connection and empowerment. So I once heard a colleague describe their undergraduate experiences related to their social locations that were certainly what would be termed at risk. They were struggling with substance abuse and with fitting into the campus environment. And they told the story of an advisor who made a difference as the one who hauled them out of bed after a night of partying and plunked them down in front of a computer to write papers. And I visualized this and I thought, this would not work for me. I would not be able to pull it off as an advisor, and I don't think I would have responded particularly well to it as a student, since my sort of dominant culture programming emphasized autonomy. However, in this colleague's case, that level of intrusiveness and academic coaching was exactly what he needed to finish his degree. And once he had finished that degree, that same advisor was right there pushing him, encouraging him, showing him the door to graduate school. So here are 2 examples of these levels of sharing cultural capital. So let's say you see someone on campus that looks a bit lost. You can walk on by, but if you choose to be helpful, here's level 1. You can just point them in the right direction. Yeah, it's over there. You can pull out a map and provide them with directions. So here you're giving a little resource, and you might say, hey, you're almost there. So a little motivation. Another cycle deeper, you can walk with them to their destination and learn about their reasons for being on campus along the way, so they experience care, hospitality, and a person that might serve as a future resource. Another example that Smith talks about, let's say a student bombs an exam. So you can stay in cycle 1 and say, you should go talk to your professor. You can hit cycle 2 by giving the same advice along with what they should say and how they might say it, in addition to asking about them about their fears and encouraging them beyond those. You might do everything in 1 and 2 with a chance for the student to role play it, and then you might follow up with both the professor and the student after that. So depending on the culture of your institution, this might be met with varying responses, but it's a level of sharing cultural capital. And I find this apprenticeship notion very challenging because I value autonomy so much. But the reasoning here is that students don't know what they don't know, and we can encourage them to self-advocate till we're blue in the face, but they can't see that hidden curriculum. So the power of this educating for the hidden curriculum is that it makes it visible to students who don't have that cultural and social capital. And when it becomes visible, hopefully it becomes transformable and changeable. Before I take your questions and move on from my sort of boring theory part of this session, I want to share a couple of final thoughts. So we're going to do some case studies next, and that look at how we serve students with varying issues. But we can't say that advising for social justice is simply looking at how we serve students from underrepresented groups or even inclusion in higher education more generally. Those are very important parts of a larger picture when we think about social justice. So we need to engage in critical reflection to raise consciousness and our own critical reflection. And that greater consciousness will help us see the interrelationship of social justice causes. And we need to seek creative solution at that point of interrelationship or integration and engage people in their own liberation, because Freire would teach us that when the oppressed act for their own liberation, they liberate the oppressor from oppressing. A couple examples of this sort of integration is here in St. Paul, there's a bike shop um, kind of down by downtown, that engages folks with disabilities in providing sales and service of mostly reused bicycles to low-income folks as a way to provide cleaner and healthier transportation alternatives. Another example is my family's doula, who's an alum of my institution's Justice and Peace Studies program, runs a program called Youth Farm. So she works with um, food supply, like a just food supply and urban, food supply, and simultaneously working with urban youth who are facing some pretty steep challenges in life. So you can probably think of numerous examples of this if you think about various service learning endeavors on your campus. Um, so are there any questions at this point? If not, I will turn it over to Shannon and Ashley. Thank you.